Patrick, as can be ascertained from reading any two accounts of his life, has been many things: a man, a slave, a Christ-like savior, a knight, and many others. It is clear that identifying an accurate, factual makeup of his life is just one of several priorities on the list of many of his biographers, and often it is not very high on that list at all. Religious conflict, political strife, and many other things influence how Patrick's image is portrayed tremendously. Nevertheless, I find that the term hero describes the man well across all interpretations. Whether he's breaking free from slavery or saving the souls of non-believers, Patrick, as is becoming of a saint, I suppose, is uniformly storied amidst scenes of righteous triumph. Those scenes would be incomplete, though, without the half that is being triumphed over, and as Patrick's most famous works occurred in Ireland, this specifically means the pagans there, that he converted to Christianity. Just as Patrick's own image is represented differently over time, so too is that of paganism, both within texts pertaining to him and in Irish culture generally, and likely for similar reasons. It's the task of this video to chart these depictions and learn from them what we may about the role of this ancient belief system in the country that fostered it. The Collectanea of Bishop Tirahan was likely written in the late 7th century, with the purpose of instating Armagh as Ireland's most significant region with regards to Christianity. Amidst his meticulous acknowledgments of church construction, though, there is also a fascinating characterization of the forces of Irish paganism that stood in Patrick's way within the document. In this manuscript, pagans and even druids, their priest-like religious leaders, have the capacity to be saved and converted to Christianity. This is evidenced by the two Irish girls who initially mistake Patrick and his group for Sheath, or angelic fairies within the Gaelic polytheistic faith, but are very quickly convinced to convert and do so with extreme eagerness. The druid Hono even, quote, welcomed Patrick and his holy people and gave Patrick his own house, unquote, apparently suggesting that virtues like selflessness and generosity, important to Christianity, could also exist within pre-converted practitioners of paganism. This makes sense. Conversion of the natives was, of course, Patrick's goal in Ireland, and the Collectanea shows those natives as potentially receptive to this. When it actually comes to the practice of their faith, though, Tirahan is merciless, describing Patrick performing violent miracles to dispatch those druids who, quote, raised a great opposition, unquote, to his advancement with their abilities. Murchu, a historian who chronicled this same era of Patrick's life in his Vita Sancti Patrici a few centuries later, explains in more detail how they crossed the line from savable to, in a word, perishable. In the Vita, druids are killed who mock Catholicism, as are the subjects of King Leary, who are ordered to, quote, seize, unquote, Patrick. Those Irish who rise in reverence to any of Patrick's arrivals are blessed, their names and subsequent histories specifically noted by Murchu. Later, in Leary's banquet hall, the druid Lokit pridefully issues repeated challenges to Patrick, using magic spells or invoking demons to cause snow and then fog to dramatically cover the plain over which they and the feastgoers looked. Each of these feats is subsequently dispelled by Patrick. Leary attempts to draw up a challenge between the two practitioners, but is unable to reach conditions that the now neurotically sheepish Lokit will agree to. It is Patrick who decides on the final test that proves fatal for the druid. Leary, despite having agreed to the contest, attempts to kill Patrick, but is in fact spared by the, quote, wrath of God, unquote, that instead vanquishes many of the king's impious subjects. From these portrayals, we can interpret that neither Tirahan or Murchu saw the pagans as savage or barbaric. In fact, Patrick's choices about who to spare and who to destroy in these narratives suggest a definite structure of authority in native Irish society. It's telling that Patrick attempts to convert Leary after killing some of his people instead of killing the king himself. It appears that Patrick understands Leary as a figure of authority who might convert to spare his remaining subjects, identifying a responsibility between ruler and ruled in their society. While they are described as heathens in the texts, the general Irish citizenry are not shown to be insolent. On the contrary, one of their main traits here is adherence to whichever figure exudes the most authority in any situation. Those in the banquet hall initially disregard Patrick's arrival, only inviting him to eat in order to scrutinize him. They quickly change their tune, though, as he performs miracle after miracle. As Patrick does away with Lokit's shroud of fog, they, quote, all cried aloud and gave thanks, unquote. Though the holy man cannot abide the use of unchristian magic by these people, he understands that the elimination of pagan religious authority and the conversion of Leary, their figure of political authority, is the best way way to convert this specific society. It is intriguing that both texts acknowledge a certain power held by the Druids, and not just one in the philosophical sense. They are shown to be capable of certain miracles themselves, like prediction of the future and the aforementioned control over weather. Marhu ascribes this to demons and spells, but the earlier Tirachan admits not to know its source. Either way, it is clear that Irish paganism is not regarded as utterly false in either text. Rather, it appears to me to represent a true challenge for Patrick, a worthy opponent whose defeat resounds as dramatically in the story as a military conquest of Ireland would have. It is odd, then, that in the face of this defeat, information about Irish pre-Christian faith is accessible today in a measure far exceeding that of England itself. Figures from Irish paganism continue to dot the country's history, as we will examine soon, but significant references to the Druidic religion that existed in England even as Rome collapsed and Ireland was evangelized are largely absent from the last millennia or so of British culture. Perhaps St. Augustine's mission to convert these Anglo-Saxon pagans was extremely successful at replacing not just their religion but their history, exempting those symbols which are now largely independent from that history, like dwarves or words like Wednesday or Friday. Meanwhile, even in Tirachan's Vita, pre-Christian practices like keening to mourn the dead and burying them in the, quote, custom of the heathen Irish, unquote, are not contradicted or even remarked upon by Patrick. That specific moment in the Vita could be the microcosm of our answer. Those heathen practices were performed in reaction to the deaths of the two previously mentioned Irish girls. Patrick ignores these practices even as he converts their participants and eventually, quote, builds an earthen church, unquote, over their burial site. Patrick, a representation of the church's authority here, accommodates the expression of non-Christian tradition almost like a safety valve to ease the pain of mourning, achieving his larger mission once this pain has passed. The saint would engage in similar accommodation in a few other texts to far greater degrees. In the Acalam na Sonorach, written sometime in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, Patrick crosses paths in his travels over Ireland with none other than remnants of the Fianna, the mythical band of warriors led by the pre-Christian Irish folk hero Fionn McCool. Perhaps the most striking quality of their meeting is that, unlike with the Druids, no conflict arises between the two parties. In fact, Patrick greatly enjoys hearing their stories depicting the Fianna's many victories and conquests. While Patrick orders these stories written down for purposes of entertainment only, it is rather incongruous with his Christian beliefs that he should derive any pleasure at all from these tales in which martial prowess is a virtue and slaughter is glorious and plentiful. He does not even object to praise being sung of a warrior who used magic to enhance his skills in combat, and actually describes the band of fighters as, quote, great, unquote. This is mirrored when Patrick asks whether Fionn himself was a good man. Quilta, another member of the Fianna, responds by highlighting the leader's lack of covetousness, a Christian virtue. This interaction is a far cry from those in the Collectanea and Vita. We might expect the Patrick of those texts to fling the Fianna members against rocks, but instead he shows tacit appreciation of the virtues that make up specifically Irish pagan morality systems. Why? It might be that, around the time the Acalam was written, the Christian identity sought to incorporate the image of the powerful warrior. This was the era of the Crusades, where military campaigns were regularly waged on religious grounds by forces gathered from all over Christendom. Only sparsely does anecdotal evidence exist suggesting Irish involvement in these wars, but this does not mean that there was no attempt to gather such involvement. It is more likely that the portrayals in the Acalam are a response to much more immediate pressures, namely those of the recently ascendant Anglo-Normans. This group's invasion and subsequent rule of much of Ireland happened in 1169, exactly the start of the Acalam's hypothesized creation period, and upended Irish society startlingly. Under this new aristocracy, many Irish found themselves forced into serfdom on land they had previously tended to as their own, their freedom limited to the service of their foreign lord. It is difficult to imagine this upheaval not highlighting the Irish identity in the minds of those affected, now that they existed in such close proximity to another very different group, and were exploited primarily based on this difference. It would follow that something of a reclamation of indigenous Irish folk heroes like Fionn should then take place. It's not likely, though, that this level of subversion was anywhere near the intent of the column's author or authors. Indeed, it is probably another instance of the safety valve of accommodation, here used to reconcile the content of the indigenous Irish storytelling tradition with the dominant Christian society it had been subsumed into. The pagans in the story, of course, convert. This reconciliation extends to another hero of Irish folklore whose shadow looms greater than even Fionn's and whose significance to this essay is on par with Patrick's, Cú Chulainn. Not unlike Heracles or Beowulf, Cú Chulainn is the preeminent warrior hero of Irish mythology, featuring prominently in several epic stories and capable of incredible feats of strength. Also like Beowulf, Cú was retroactively converted to Christianity, and writings created centuries after his life is said to have taken place. Admittedly, Beowulf is not aware of Christianity, but somehow nonetheless extols virtues aligned with it and predicts the coming of Jesus. The Hagiography Cún Chulainn, or the Phantom Chariot of Cú Chulainn, is a text whose author and date of creation are not known, though it is speculated to have been written somewhere between the 12th and 15th centuries. It expands on the interaction between Patrick and King Leary that results in the latter's conversion, with the summoning of Cú himself by the saint the text's namesake event. The adjustments to the figure of Cú Chulainn made here are manifold. He is conjured by Patrick from the underworld, implying his damnation as a pagan, but he has apparently had a change of faith as a result of his centuries of torment. Quote, "Great as was my heroism, hard as was my sword, the devil crushed me with one finger into the red charcoal." This warning about the pains of hell is considered by Tom Pete Cross and Clark Harris Slover, two editors of a 1969 translation of the tale, to be the main thrust of Cú's argument here, but it also carries cultural implications. Leary does not initially believe that this spirit is actually the hero and implores him to prove it by recounting the events of his life. As Cú launches into verse after verse detailing his feats, it becomes clear that he is engaging in the poetic Irish storytelling tradition, something Leary can not only identify with, but identify Cú Chulainn by. The story culminates in Cú bemoaning that not even the gay Bolga can contend with the devil. This is immensely significant, as that legendary weapon consistently represents assured victory for its wielder across Irish mythology. His martial ability and the undefeated gay Bolga are powerless against the Christian devil, producing the image of Gaelic folklore being entirely couched within and at the mercy of Christian cosmology. Bringing Cú back from the dead to redeem him is not without precedent in these texts. A form of this actually appears in the Vita Sancti Patrici, where Patrick unearths the tomb of a long-dead giant warrior, and after conversing with him and learning of his, quote, many torments, unquote, baptizes him and lays him to now peaceful rest. Clearly, while the actual practice of druidism is unacceptable, there is still a place in Christian culture for the heroic warrior archetype. Up until this point, we've discussed conflict primarily in the religious realm, how religious texts address social issues, and the ways in which Irish paganism and Catholicism become entangled. Despite the cropping up of pagan characters or virtues over the years, though, it cannot be argued that Christianity as introduced by Patrick has been the status quo in Ireland for centuries, along with the long-term social consequences of Anglo-Irish rule. What happens then if a group attempts to remove the entirety of British influence from this equation? We don't have to speculate. The Celtic theatre was proposed in 1897 by dramatists Lady Gregory and W.B. Yeats, among others, as a home for new Irish plays. Though pitched to potential guarantors as ideologically, quote, outside all the political questions that divide us, unquote, the groundwork laid by the proposition foreshadowed the country's most politically significant artistic institution of the era, the Abbey Theatre. Let's examine the first play performed at the Abbey's opening in 1904, Yeats's On Bale Strand. Right from the beginning, the content seems odd. If this new Celtic theatre was meant to illuminate the art form's future in Ireland, it is curious that its first presentation to the world should be a story of Cú Chulainn, whose lifetime is typically portrayed hundreds of years before the birth of Christ. This is quite intentional, though. It seems that, according to the leading Irish dramatists of the time, the country was in need of a reminder of its own history before its future could be assured. How then is Cú Chulainn, the hero of pre-Christian Ireland, represented? We might start by noting his representation in the first place. The portrayal of a mythic figure by an ordinary person in any culture is significant, whether it be Thomas Betterton as the titular character in the 1691 British opera King Arthur or the British Worthy, or Tu Lu Hao, who over the last 2 decades has made a career of his performances as Sun Wukong or the Monkey King, a character in Chinese folklore invented only in the 16th century, but whose ubiquity in China is equal to that of Arthur's in Britain. The effect of being audience to a member of one's own culture, elevating themselves, however temporarily, to fill the shoes of that sort of character, which comes to represent a society's very ideals, cannot be overstated. In Dublin, at the beginning of the 20th century, these ideals were anti-British, due in no small part to the politics of those supplying the Abbey Theatre with plays. This, in contrast to the version of Cuchulainn that reconciles with St. Patrick, is a reclamation of the hero by those who likely viewed themselves as warriors like him and wanted to highlight his Irish indigeneity. This notion is supported by the statue of the legendary character at the General Post Office in Dublin, commemorating the building's involvement in the Easter Rising, a violent revolt in 1916 that the Abbey Theatre's ideological output probably expedited. It is unlikely that a re-establishment of the pagan pantheon from which Cú is descended was ever on the table for Irish nationalists, but their adoption of him does create the image of a war being waged on 2 fronts, political and religious. That Patrick brought the first taste of foreign dominion to Ireland with his religious work there does connect both shifts, but as is often the case in the politics of Irish independence, things become muddied fast. To exemplify that, I'd like to finally jump to the present for yet one more depiction of Cuchulainn, this one the most vexing combination of pagan and Christian philosophies that will be presented here. Belfast's Ulster Museum recently had on exhibit 2 murals, each depicting the death of the hero. One, painted by Marty Lyons and another Belfast artist, retains the image of a figure slumped away from a stone from which they hang by a strap, but swaps out Cú himself for Francis Hughes, a provisional IRA member who died on hunger strike. The other, which we'll examine more closely, was painted by D. Craig, also a Belfast artist who previously participated in projects to color over the paramilitary murals there. Adoption of Cuchulainn in Catholic-Protestant sectarian conflict is contested. Because he is specifically a hero of the Ullid, a pre-invasion kingdom in Ireland's northwest, some Ulster Unionists claim him as a symbol of their defense of the region and its partially English culture. Supporters of complete Irish independence claim him as a general signifier of indigenous Irish strength. In Craig's mural, the hero holds a shield bearing the Ulster banner, symbolizing Northern Ireland as a part of the United Kingdom. His body leans from the standing stone, casting the shadow of a gunman. Red text reads, "Down through the years, his shadow has cast a new breed of Ulster defender," implying that resistance towards Irish republicanism is a duty inherited from Cú. Craig also infuses the mural's unionist politics with Christianity, though. Cú's pose is remarkably Christ-like, recalling the latter's crucifixion and martyrdom and recasting the unionist effort as rather like the Republican one in that it is bolstered by martyrs every generation or so. The introduction of this concept is where the mural's consistency falters, because of course Cuchulainn was not a Christian, unless the Phantom Chariot is Craig's only reference, and his death was not a willing martyrdom as Jesus's was, or even a martyrdom at all. Craig's aim with the Christ-like imagery seems to make Cú fit within Christian culture, but past the surface level, the mural's 2-pronged religious and political ideology contradicts itself. The fiercely territorial philosophy manifested here reflects Cuchulainn's own, yes, but adherence to this code produces some of the character's least Christian moments, among those being defiance to gods and his interactions with the Morrigan, and the murder of his own son caused by his son's disrespect of the Ullid. Indeed, Cú's final act was the exact opposite of a martyr's. By tying himself upright in the standing position, he refuses the idea of his own death. This is not in line with Christian doctrine, but is certainly agreeable to that glorious martial virtue so revered in pagan heroic tales. The Unionist mural attempts to acknowledge the unique Northern Irish perspective, but in its choice of content actually unifies most with the warrior philosophy also adopted by Irish Republicans. In several ways, St. Patrick and Cuchulainn are opposite symbols. Patrick represents not just a link to, but the dominance of a global community in Christianity. Cuchulainn, on the other hand, is not nearly as famous outside of Ireland as he is to the country's own community. Whereas other countries like Britain or the United States have developed their own respective visions of St. Patrick, Cuchulainn remains relatively unappropriated, even as similar characters, such as Heracles, have entered the global heroic lexicon. Perhaps this is a result of Christianity's containment of Irish pagan and folkloric culture. The texts examined in this video show the measured capacity at which this culture was permitted to exist over the centuries. Perhaps it is simply the unhelpful anglicized spelling of Cuchulainn's name. It is worth noting, then, how closely the date of the Cu statue's erection at the General Post Office coincides with the Irish Republic's establishment in 1937. It seems that the motivation to venerate this culture has always existed in the hearts of those who descend from it, and only awaits opportunities and occasions to do so. Christianity itself has not been removed from Ireland, but by the reclamation of pre-Christian ideas and figures, it seems that Ireland has succeeded in forging its own way of faith, free from the shadow of dominion.